Jim, thank you very much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since following your newsletter, Deconstructionology, also just having had a conversation with you previously, I'm really, really intrigued to see where you take us today.
Yeah, I'm super excited about just, kind of sitting down and having a chat about what the good life is and wherever we happen to go in this conversation. I've enjoyed following your work, and I think we have some mutual. I think I discovered you through some other people, and so I don't know. It's just really cool to connect with other people and see what they're doing, and the ways that you've sort of been encouraging and challenging me to embrace life more fully and to look at it more open mindedly. And so, yeah, I'm just really excited to have this conversation.
Wonderful. So, as you're aware, Jim, it begins with, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
I think for me, the question is, what does it mean to be with the more than human world? And I think this question is significant for me because I've operated in a realm that really focuses on the human person, self actualization, and even the humanism as a non religious path to follow on the other side of those who might be leaving religion. And I just kind of feel like that what sort of has been missing in that conversation is the more than human world, and that to live a complete life and to move forward as Homo sapiens in this universe, that we really need to think through what it means to be with all of the world, including the more than human world. So something that I'm thinking about in my own professional work with people, my own personal life. Am I thinking about what does it mean to live a good life? Like what that question even means in light of being part of the universe as a whole and being one species um, among many, one of the less than 1% of species that have managed to survive in the universe. And so I think that that's something that's really caught my attention. I think another one, which is related to that, is that I do come out of a very Western, Eurocentric, that's my background. I'm a white American male. And a lot of my academic work, a lot of my professional work has sort of kind of been in this global north realm. And so I think that a big question related to kind of being with the more than human world or all the world is including going back and looking at some deficits in my human development because of my lack of engagement with the global south, for example, and the contributions that people make in terms of indigenous cosmologies, indigenous spiritualities, and the wealth of what we gain from studying and connecting with people all over the world. And for me, that's meant getting outside of this like Western Eurocentric realm and not preferencing that approach to understanding life, and sort of diversifying my understanding of my existence in life through relating to how people are living and what their own values and mindsets and traditions and histories are. So I don't know. I'm a explorer. I'm a self learner. I pretty much every person I meet, my thought is that this person knows something that I need to learn in order to be a more complete human being. And I have found that to be true. It's definitely an adventure. And then understanding how to kind of bring all that into my work with people is really a lot of fun. And I really love it.
Could you, Jim, tell me what your evolution has been with that question of what does it mean to be with the more than human world? Like, what has that taken different expressions or inquiries, or when, I guess, when has it even emerged for you?
Yeah, I think that just kind of the quick Cliff Notes backstory version of my life is that I grew up in a loosely religious home. My parents divorced when I was young. My mother was an alcoholic. My father left our family when I was a young boy. There was a lot of volatility and chaos and suffering and heartache and abuse in the family situation I grew up in. So I came out of that and became attracted to religion as a solution. So I became a religious person. I went off to college. I got involved in religious organizations. After doing my undergrad in journalism, I went to Chicago, went to theological school, was credentialed as a minister, and entered into full time Christian ministry. I was the pastor at a megachurch and did this for a number of years until I had a crisis of faith, which caused me to question the belief system that I inherited and that I had sort of fine tuned through all my theological studies and had come to depend on for a sense of identity and existential well being. And a string of things caused me to question all of that. So ultimately, I decided to walk away from my ministerial career, walk away from the religion of my youth and my attachments to religion, and kind of figure out, okay, what went wrong and what do I, where do I go from here? So eventually that leads to my um, connecting with other people who have also found religion to be a difficult path. In fact, some people who were even damaged, harmed, or traumatized through, toxic religious indoctrination and this sort of thing. And this was 30 years ago when all this started. And then eventually that kind of continued to expand, and I began to write on this topic. I founded this Center for Non-Religious Spirituality. I, work with people around the topic of non-religious spiritual formation, overcoming religious trauma and toxic religious indoctrination. And all of that's still happening in sort of the Western, Eurocentric. I mean, even the concept of deconstruction, which is mainly built on Derrida's work, postmodern sort of philosophical work around deconstruction. That missing piece has always really kind of been the more than human component of you know, um, spiritual formation, spiritual reconstruction, and so on. So I started running into some people that we both know. Jessica's a perfect example, where like over time I began running into people who were articulating their thoughts about the more than human world. And so as I'm a collaborator, so I reach out to people when I say, well, I need to learn more about this and so on. And so the more I've investigated and collaborated with people, I noticed that this was missing from my life and a big part of my work. Now, I'm one of those people who naturally has an appreciation for the more than human world from the standpoint that I'm an outdoorsman. I enjoy hiking, am a runner, and so on. But despite that personal part of my life, I've still never made a deep enough connection to my influence on the more than human world, my humility as only one species in the more than human world, and my thinking about my existence in relationship to the more than human world. And those were the pieces that I really started to recognize, and has influenced even the way I've thought about the question, what is the good life? So I'm currently living in Costa Rica. I'm a U.S. citizen, was born in the U.S. and so on. Currently living in Costa Rica, and which has been quite useful because there is a greater sense of the more than human world and our relationship with the more than human world and so on. And so that's also been just a great experience in terms of like helping me develop more of those kind of sensibilities uh, and opening myself to the world in these ways that I have not previously, in years past, have been more, connected into. So I'm very, I like historically, I'm a very cerebral person. I'm a critical thinker. I do deconstruction work, talker. So, but the embodied spirituality, somatic work in your spiritual formation and acknowledgement of um, all living things and my place among those living things, and what that looks like, are things that I've kind of grown into over the years, and like people like Jessica and Samar Yunes and many other people have articulated that aspect of the human journey in ways that I've just have been really compelling for me personally. I guess has been kind of part of my evolution.
Yeah, I've rarely heard someone take me through their in the earlier part of what you were saying, just take me through so much of their life, while giving me such a feeling for it, and yet have gone through such substantial things in such a quick order as well. Just really curious, the crisis of faith, but also the experience of being a pastor at a megachurch. I've just never talked to somebody who's been a pastor at a megachurch, and so I don't mean this with any assumptions or anything like that. But what was that experience like? And I guess especially even in the context of coming from your background, seeing religion as a solution, and then I guess what kind of led into the crisis of faith with amongst that.
Yeah, I think that so the way culture does have a way of preferencing certain forms of religious life.
Yeah,
So back in the, let's say, the mid 70s and in the 80s and so on, this idea of the sort of centristic consumption model of religious life. You go somewhere and you sort of fill up like a gas station with getting your spiritual needs met. And the best scenario for that is to almost create like a mall like setting with a lot of options, a lot of classes, a lot of possibilities for people to connect with their religious life. And so the mega church model sort of really fit into that. It was the kind of mega church model that I was involved in was something that was called seeker targeted, which was very performance oriented in terms of its presentation and a very contemporary approach to the religious life. For example, Joel Osteen's church maybe it has some similarities in that it's very performance oriented. You probably have a worship time that's led by world class musicians. It incorporates the creative arts. The messages are topical and relate to people's lives. And there's a lot of options for families. There's something for children, something for infants, something for toddlers, something for preteens, something for teenagers, young adult, so it's kind of like the one stop shopping experience for a person's spiritual and religious interest. And of course, there's a downside to that in a lot of different ways. Like the whole consumption model has some real downsides. One of which is that it can be difficult to foster authentic community and relationships on a micro level because people are really more attracted to the big wow programs, and it's a little more difficult to facilitate within that context an infrastructure for people to develop the more intimate relationships. Like one of the things that we often talked about, or that I look, that, kind of in hindsight, is that we tended to create meeting based relationships. You came to the church, you went to the meeting, and then whatever that meeting was, a class, a workshop, and then everybody went home, not to see each other or talk to each other again until they were back in sort of the meeting. So very centralized, which in some ways is Christianity originally. And of course, we can't roll the clock back to the first century, but I'm just saying that it was very decentralized. It was more decentralized, that Christianity was viewed more as a set of practices and actions in the community, engaging people. And it wasn't necessarily tied exclusively to institutional involvement. Going to an official meeting or course and becoming an official member. And so, in some ways, the religious life is mediated through a commitment to the organization, but may not be empowering or equipping people to actually live the values in the context of their everyday life. So, this is like the proverb, the guy who drives his family to church on Sunday morning and they're all dressed up and happy and engaging, and then they all go home and fight and hate each other and
Yeah,
doing
yeah,
terrible things. So, in my experience as a mega pastor is that, it was stressful. It is being more like a business CEO. It's managing a organization and a business and all the different facets, budgets, buildings, board members. And so I wasn't necessarily equipped in my ministerial training to real. Now, in recent years, there's been accommodations to that. It's not uncommon for larger churches to have a position on the staff team with the person who's doing more of the business management side, because it's often asking too much for the pastor to be theologically trained, to do pastoral counseling, to basically oversee a multi-million-dollar business, and all those different components. My crisis of faith was one day recognizing that despite the show, despite the bulletproof theology that I developed in seminary, there's no one who represented evangelical theology better than I did, in my work as a pastor. But despite all that, I began noticing that the same problems in people's lives persisted. Divorce, unhealed inner neuroses, depression, anxiety, broken relationships, and so on, that it seemed like despite everything that those problems persisted. Like, why is that? Why, if I'm presenting the right theology about God, if I'm teaching the Bible properly, shouldn't that be transforming people at the psychological, relational, spiritual level? And my observation that it wasn't really doing that. And then at a very rare moment of self-honesty, I accepted that not only was it not really doing it for them, it was not doing it for me. I was anxious, I was depressed, I was burned out. I couldn't say that I was like some model of spiritual formation and human development. I was racing around, trying to manage the operations and so on. And so I knew that something was like way off. And I had to come to some answer, but and I had to leave to figure it out. This is what I was thinking at the time. Like, I can't figure it out while I'm doing it. I need to step away from it and get a different perspective and see if I can figure out what the problem is. And and I could diagnose what those problems are on many different levels, but on a fundamental level, one of them is that the theological scaffolding that we attach people to is that I was attaching people to that I was saying was going to be the ticket for your liberation, and you're thriving and flourishing as a human being. That theological scaffolding, not only was it flawed and not capable of delivering that, it actually did harm in like a number of different ways. In fact, it would actually require a person to completely deconstruct the whole theological system, and and it would likely result in a person letting go of huge chunks of that entire belief structure if you hope to, you know, find peace, harmony, liberation, and growth in your life. And so that's exactly what I started doing bit by bit. Okay, what went wrong here? What do I believe about God? What do I believe about the Bible? What do I believe about eternal life? What do I, and at every single level of that belief structure scaffolding, it was seriously flawed from my, from my point of view in that. Um, and well, and then the further you deconstruct, you start learning things like, well, actually, I had a very conditioned view and interpretive lens of the Bible that led even to that theological scaffolding. It wasn't even necessary. This isn't even the only way to understand or approach or interpret the Bible itself. But I didn't know that at the time because I just look, this is what I learned, like you either believe these things or you're wrong or you're not a Christian or whatever. And
Just out of interest, Jim, what was that like though? Like in the sense of, you have this way of almost interpreting the world, engaging the world. It's tied not only to your, a belief system, an identity, but the your livelihood. I'm assuming just from the position you're alluding to there, you had plenty to give up in that, in terms of, let's say, material ways in which people look at the world. Was this like what was the blend? Like, it almost sounds like a blend of inquiry, crisis, and curiosity. What was going on for you?
well, I don't want to, it's difficult to accurately convey the loss,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, like a person's entire identity is usually wrapped up in their religious tradition, who they understand themselves to be, what they see their meaning and purpose in the world is, all their understanding of all the big existential questions of life. They're all grounded in their religion. So when you walk away from it, your relationships, your social network, for me, my career, my financial stability, it was all tied up in my ministerial career. And when I left, it all collapsed. So the way this looked like for a long time, and if you grew up, well, like if you went through theological training, for example, there isn't, at least at that time, there wasn't a whole lot of like career transition options, right? Like you're an ex-pastor trying to figure out, what do I need to do to earn an income, and so on. So there was a there was years when I pulled down drywall and carried lumber across construction sites, working low wage minimal jobs by day and doing individual work with people who had been traumatized by religion at night. Now that was one of the best things that I ever did because it thrust me into, which I'll use this phrase. It's not entirely the best phrase, but it did thrust me into the real world.
yeah.
Like, not the theological, not the religious subculture that you're in. Like, there's a whole nother world of people, you know, um, at all kinds of different levels of socioeconomic class. And you learn something about the world there that all your nice sounding theological answers that you developed in seminary, like, okay, that's not going to work here, and part of my journey was also I traveled the world doing international human rights work. I investigated cases of forced uh, child prostitution, forced child labor. I posed as a customer in brothels and slave camps, and that experience, then all my theology about justice and the goodness of God and the love of God and the sovereignty of God and all these theological doctrines, what was left of them also collapsed. So much of my doctrine collapsed in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in India, when I sat in brothels watching little 14-year-old girls walk out on a catwalk to present themselves to sex tourists who were going to choose one of these girls to basically go back in a room and rape them. And these girls are forced to do that 5 or 6 times a day, 6 days a week. Or little boys chained to poles who were rolling cigarettes, and if they didn't meet their quota, they were beaten with electrical cords. So it's like, okay, we got a real problem here relating what I learned in terms of my theology and what I taught people and the kind of world that I presented to people and what it's really like when you're not in that subculture. You know, um, Now, I'm not saying that, religious people in megachurch subcultures don't have suffering, they don't struggle, they don't have hardship, or they're completely oblivious to the suffering of the world. I'm just saying that a lot of people in those subcultures do a really good job of creating a false sort of happiness, kind of that shiny, happy people. If you're aware of
Yeah.
that movie and all that, like we all polish our faces, we put on our best, we maintain a sense of being okay and all this kind of thing. And so,
But interestingly though too, it's I'd say that's not even specific, right, to religious subculture or specific subcultures of religion. Like this is almost like the way you're describing that there almost describes kind of upper middle classes or middle classes to upper middle classes of and higher of a way of projecting their lives, or you know almost like a sense of and that's a generalization. I'm not across a whole group of people, but I just mean the kind of idea that we don't let each other know what our problems are. We pretend that we've kind of got things under control. We'll tell people if somebody got a scholarship or they got top results. We won't tell if they were found with, I don't know, marijuana or something on them. Do you know what I mean? Like it's that kind of thing where it's all quietly, it's all quietly presented, or it's like it's quite a curated existence that people are showing.
yeah, well, let me just real quick
Yeah, sure.
respond to people, people, most people really can endure a great load of cognitive dissonance before they can't anymore.
Hmm.
And a lot of people will leave religion because that cognitive dissonance becomes so, you, you know, despairing and disillusioning, but you could go a long, long way with that cognitive dissonance. So, and like, let's just take social media. Somebody goes on Facebook and they post something that says, I just want to thank God because my husband is in remission for cancer. And we prayed and thanked God for miracles. Meanwhile, somebody reading that post just lost a child to leukemia and prayed fervently that this person would be healed, and yet their child died. So, like, there is this cognitive dissonance that lurks around in Christian subculture, but depending on who you are, you can endure it. And of course, we all have our answers. God works in mysterious ways. This person's now an angel in heaven, or they're in a better place, or just all the platitudes that we tend to have to sort of like soothe the cognitive dissonance between the teachings that we have about God and religious teachings, and the complexities of the and inconsistencies and the paradoxes of the lived human experience. Now, to be fair, or not to be fair, but just to kind of just to kind of throw this in, is that people's experience of religion. Well, first off, there's 8 million different experiences of religion because every living human being has some experience of religion, and so it's not like a monolithic thing, right? So, you know, I can't. I sometimes use some qualifiers when I talk about religion, like I might call it toxic religion or fundamentalist religion or whatever, because it would be wrong to assume that every person's experience of of religion is the same. And if you apply intersectionality to this deconstruction religion space, you learn that you know that um, there are, and so just to be mindful that if someone asked me, Jim, do you think religion does more harm than good? I would say I think it does more harm than good, but I wouldn't say it does no good, right? Like, there are people, we could come up with a list of people like Martin Luther King Jr., although I think that he had a PhD from Boston University, was very shrewd in how he used religion in the South as a motivation to confront racism. So I'm not saying, I don't think Martin Luther King is necessarily the poster child for being a good evangelical Christian, but I think he understood that there are religious motivations that can be powerfully focused on achieving good in the world, you know? And so, um, not all religion obviously is bad, and even the word religion is a you know I speak of non-religious spirituality, and not anti-religious but non-religious, as a way of saying people who are interested in spirituality kind of beyond the frameworks of traditional religion. But if you study like the philosophy of religion, for example, William James actually used the word religion to refer to what we kind of mean now by the word spirituality, right? Like there's a spiritual but not religious movement, and um, there's actually some very good ways to repurpose traditional religion in a non-religious space, and so sometimes people will say, well, I'm done with religion, all those rules and teachings and practices and disciplines. But as it turns out, you know, sometimes it's good to have a few practices or rules of life you follow, or groups of people you associate with that share common values. Like you can repurpose a lot of what's good about religion without the theology that can do harm. Like the belief in eternal conscious torment or hell, the belief in the original sin condition, that we're inherently bad and can't trust ourselves as human beings. This idea that God is a separate thing in the universe and we are powerless and we must depend on this other big other to supply everything that we need because we can't access it ourselves through our natural capabilities. Like those kinds of teachings can do a lot of harm, in my view.
Tell me, Jim, what was it like for you then, or could you even describe the process of, as you said, even in being confronted almost by the limits of the application of what you were teaching in certain spaces, whether if it was just people that you were meeting through the trauma that were experiencing trauma from it, people on the building side, these harrowing recount or recollections of things in Thailand, and even that acknowledgement of, okay, well, if I say I'm praying for my partner or my loved one and they survive, if it was because of that, then how come somebody else in a similar situation, maybe even more diligent in their prayer, didn't experience the same thing? Where did you, and then just to the acknowledgements again of this sentiment of, okay, now we're like, how do we build up kind of this sense of like a sentiment of a spiritual formation in a non-religious
Yeah.
context?
So
How did you, yeah, just curious, how did you kind of did did the baby go out with the bathwater at some stage? Or did you just learn to kind of, as you're even acknowledging with William James, reconnect with sentiments that maybe not they're not centrally owned by something or somebody?
Yeah, I think for me initially when I left religion, because in my case, it was a very insular environment. Like your the information you should be working on for your life is like what you're finding in the Bible, mainly, almost exclusively. So stay away from all these other world religions. Don't get in all this secular knowledge that questions God. A lot of people that leave religion have significant human development deficits, and one of them is that they have a very insufficient base of human knowledge because they've been so tightly like woven into that religious subculture, and it's essentially made them fear anything outside of it. So for me, like for example, well, I lived in this neighborhood. I would go running. One day I noticed this other guy running. We spoke a little bit. We developed a friendship. Turns out this guy is a Buddhist scholar. He's a practicing Mahayana Buddhist and does scholarship, does translations of Buddhist sutras and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, we strike up a friendship. Of course, previously in my religious days, I would be like, whoa, okay, nah, Buddha's dead in the ground somewhere and Jesus rose from the dead. So, I'm sticking with Jesus kind of thing. Like that's kind of what
Yeah,
you
yeah.
learn. Okay. So, but man, our relationship is like, okay, well, wow. Here's some different ways to think about this. Here's some different ways to think about the nature of reality, to think about human suffering, to think about life after death. Oh, yeah. And that's a gateway into Eastern spirituality, as a whole. Wow. They've figured some things out in the East. Their understanding of spirituality, those wisdom traditions, which I was never all that aware of, that was like opening a doorway of exploration. Um, Wanda, the Waffle House waitress. I would go to Waffle House and sit down and journal about my leaving religion. And Wanda was the waitress, and she'd come over and talk. And she goes, well, one day she said, well, what book are you reading or what are you working on? That led to a religious conversation or a conversation about religion, in which Wanda said, you know, I I went to church one time and I'll never go back. And I went to this church. The only way I was able to go is I had to go when I got off work. I was wearing my Waffle House waitress uniform. And I swear, people in that church treated me like I was a whore. Church is not for the Wandas at Waffle Houses. At least her experience wasn't. She didn't fit the expectation of the kind of person who comes to church. She wasn't dressed up. She was wearing her, people were like, well, what is, like, um, so little by little, the car mechanic, a hip hop musician, a girl with cerebral palsy that I had an encounter with at the local library, a tire salesman, you know, a, a left a liberal Democrat person, which I came out of, I'm, Christian and therefore I must be Republican, like I came that style of Christianity, right? You know, when I started realizing, oh my God, these people are not evil. Actually, I like these people and I'm learning from these people and they're opening doors for me to learn things that I never had the opportunity, to learn. I tell people that the most important deconstruction tool and reconstruction tool is, and I know this sounds so, uninspiring, but is knowledge and learning. Like to keep exploring beyond the boundaries of the world that you've been shown and to be open and curious. And so, and that's kind of what happened to me. Every new person I met, every different religion I encountered, every atheist or non religious person, it was just opening a bunch of doors for me to run through and explore further and further and further and further. So now, keep in mind that now, okay, I estimated over the last 25, 30 years, I've spent about 40,000 hours working with people in religious deconstruction and reconstruction. Over the course of that time, you see the common denominators. You start developing sort of methods and frameworks to address the issues that people commonly have. You mentioned one of them, which is a lot of times people who leave religion, they initially feel a sense of betrayal. There's anger, there's grief, there's loss, and those are all normal human emotions that need to be processed. But they have to be processed, because if you don't process them, you kind of get stuck in what I call you become an angry camp dweller. Like, you never get past, I hate religion, religion is bad, this is what religion did to me. And again, that's a normal look. If you're an ex-Mormon or an ex independent fundamentalist Baptist church, and you were traumatized and spiritually abused and other forms of abuse through your religious background, like it's going to take a while to work through the trauma, the anger, the grief, the betrayal, the disillusionment, and so on. And even in the reconstruction doesn't necessarily mean you're going to suddenly have these rosy perspectives about your past religious tradition, but there's a way to work through it. There's a way to address the human development deficits. There are ways to rewild, using Jessica and other people's language, to rewild spirituality untethered from toxic religious indoctrination, untethered from those features of religion that were harmful, and to construct a more liberating, meaningful, and if this is your thing, a non-religious path, you know, going forward. Um, and so it's a and really the deconstruction reconstruction component is just a part of life, right? Like, we're always there's always an element of sort of looking at where we're at and evaluating and applying critical thinking, and then, adding to it or morphing it or growing out of it or expanding it, you know. But there are some very specific elements that you have to address for many people. Like, back when I started religious deconstruction really wasn't even a term yet, and religious trauma syndrome wasn't even like a thing yet. And it probably is going to be on the next DSM. And we have learned a lot about, addressing religious trauma, which in the US, a recent survey said one in three people said that they have at some point in their lives been traumatized through religious experience. And if you're LGBTQI plus, it's an inordinate number of people who were victimized through their involvement in traditional religion. But there's ways to work through it. There's a process that you can work, right? Like, even grief, right? Like, there's the 5 stages of grief. It's not like it's can be shrink wrapped into some linear process, but we've learned some things about how to deal with some of these issues. And reconstructing a meaningful spirituality out of a very toxic religious background is something that can be done and is done every single day by people. And I train non-religious spiritual directors and existential health practitioners to do this work with people, specifically to kind of help them through that process.
And for you, Jim, what surprised you, even about your own process of rewilding spirituality, if we say that, or reconstruction? Like, what are the elements, or what has become part of that makeup for you that, I don't know, at one point you wouldn't have deemed that would be a natural progression of this, or just that would have been, I don't know, too far out?
Well, there's so many, in a feature of toxic religion, let's say, is that it's very binary, and it's very stereotypical in its understanding of other people. So There's not a lot of spectrum thinking here. It's like it's very there's that binary element, and so like a perfect example would be that okay, um, you're either a Christian or an atheist, and Christians are right and atheists are not, and Christians live good lives and love God and do good things, and atheists are godless and we are probably up to no good because how can they be moral and good if they have no God and so on. So like that's one of an endless list of ways that the religious mindset works. Um, and none of that is true in so many different ways. Like, for example, I've done a lot of work around Christian atheism. It's a thing, like you got people walking around, um, like the Marxist philosopher Zizek, who just wrote a book on Christian atheism. Yet there is a huge interest in the Christian narrative on the part of atheists for reasons other than why the traditional Christian finds value in it. You know, um, Now, I would have certainly look. You cannot claim in any way that you somehow have found something that you're calling Christian and be an atheist. It just no, it's not possible. Um, and atheism would be the last place I would ever look if I wanted to find any kind of more progressive form of some kind of Christian values. But all of that is false. All of it's true. In fact, in some ways, I would say Jesus was an atheist because Jesus did not subscribe to the God of religion that so many people get from their traditional background. In fact, there are so many things that Jesus would have in common with atheists. It's like astounding. And this is the only way I know to sort of explain an enduring interest in the person Jesus, even among people who are non-religious, which for me, I don't really care. Like if you want to find meaning in Jesus, great. If you don't, great. Look, you do you, whatever you find that works. But I have been surprised at, you know, the robust nature of atheist spirituality, for example, and the engagement among atheists, even with the Christian narrative. And I wish more Christians would listen to them. I think they might learn something more deeply about their own tradition in terms of what it offers people universally, and so on. And I think that coming out of my religious background, I also learned the whole thing. Well, the body is basically bad. Like you're born with original sin. You can't trust yourself. The body is the problem. That's why the real solution is you die and go to heaven, and you get a new body, and you no longer have this corrupt, human body to work with, and so on. And my valuing of our species and our natural capabilities and skills and tendencies in in order to cultivate a life of goodness and meaning for ourselves and in the world and so on. Previously, I would have been very resistant to this idea, that we essentially don't have what it takes to be the people to be good people in the world. This is why we need God, right? Like, because of this problem that we have. And I've come to see that there is no problem fundamentally in the way that religion characterizes it. There's not a sin condition that we inherited because Adam and Eve sinned and it got passed genetically through childbirth, all the way to human beings, and that there's something fundamentally flawed about the human person. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with the fact that there's a real spectrum of human beings with all sorts of different things going on, including people who have deep psychosis and are psychotic and do a lot of evil and harm in the world. But what I'm saying is that our essential human nature, what we have now evolved into as a species, is plenty to work with and build on and utilize for individual, collective, societal, and planetary flourishing. Um, and that, and perhaps another one is that even my understanding of God, right? Like, when you leave religion, you discover, oh God, Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, nobody talked about God more than that guy, but he was also considered to be an atheist and didn't believe in a personal God at all. So what is that like? And then you start discovering there's pantheism and panentheism and panpsychism, and, like there's other conceptions of God other than monotheism, but you don't know that until you get out and you start like looking around a little bit. Now, I have a problem with the word God altogether, and if I could make it one, yeah, added to the list of 45,000 obsolete words in the English language, I would put the word God there, never to be used again, because I think that you can't unsee all the baggage you've learned about that word in order to come up with something really that's going to be decisively different. Like, how people say you can't unsee something once you see it. Well, I don't think we can unreligion the word God. No matter how hard we try, there are features to that word that I don't think that we can undo. Like, and I'm not saying there's necessarily all these perfect alternatives to the word God, source, energy, ultimate reality, the ground of being, all the, like that. Every term has its shortcomings. But I think the baggage in the word God is very difficult to overcome. But back in my religiousness, like, oh my God, Jim, seriously, you're gonna not use the word God? You're gonna think of God in some pantheistic way? What are you, some weird tree hugging universalist? I mean, like this is right on par with you. You might as well become a Satanist if you're going to believe all that stuff, because it's a rejection of the religion that you learn.
Can you tell me, Jim, the what that that opening question that you started with? What does it mean to be with the more than human world?
Yeah.
Um, and describing that somewhat as a missing piece in the other stages in your life, and of course your interpretations of what that means for wider groups as well. But just that and the I don't know what that represents to you from your own kind of relationship with spirituality at this point, and how that has shaped you as well.
Yeah, I think that kind of tying it to this little tirade I went on about God, there is a way to stop thinking about God as a noun and think of God as a verb. It's unfortunate, probably the word God in that sense kind of convolutes it, but the idea is that the the highest truth and ultimate reality is not a thing that you find. It's a way, it's a process, it's a verb, it's a way of being with life. All of it. Humans, more than human world, and so on. So God is what happens at that moment of interaction between you and everything else. And I hate using the word God because when you use the word God, it sort of like implies that there's some other thing going on beyond what you're doing and so on. But I'm just saying that maybe a way to say it is that the ultimate and highest truth people are looking for, and the ultimate and highest and most transcendent experience for the human person, it all happens in the moment of your encounter with all of the world. And if you want to be a happier person, or if you want to be a more complete person, or if you want to know even God more, it has to do with a a willingness to be with all of life as it unfolds and arises. um, every emotion, every encounter, every experience, it's all of that. I think we talked a little bit about this before we
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, yeah.
started about what is the good life. And, you know, me being a deconstructive person, I looked at that question first like that. I thought, well, okay, well, let's start with the word what, because what sometimes implies that there's a definable thing. Okay, what is the good life? Okay, let's define it. Let's explain it. It's this thing, and so there's it's a what. Now I know that that's not what you mean, but I'm just saying that
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting though because that's the reason why even the word "a" was picked quite deliberately, not as what is their good life, but what is a good life,
a
and
good life, yes,
from the perspective of someone's personal interpretation. But I think what you're touching on there, as far as how I perceive it, is it's an experience of something divine rather than a theory or an idea about what could be divine. And I think that I think it comes back to some of your ideas of even just like the centralization of and the consumption of a religion, in the sense of, and it almost happens too with I must say, like I don't know about you, but I saw a therapist in my early 30s, and sometimes I'd hold on to some of my emotional stuff to present it to the therapist and go,
right,
and now we will explore it. I'm wondering why. Wait a minute, I don't feel like crying about this now, or this doesn't feel as alive. But this happened 3 days ago, Mark. Of
right,
course,
right,
I, I haven't just taken a Polaroid and stayed in that spot.
yeah.
But I think that there is something about I think there's something really beautiful though in the way you describe this, like the connection with everything. It's in moments in my life where I'm open to both the despair and the suffering and just the joy and the euphoria of this life almost at the same time, where I can't be, not in doubt, and I'm not in any need to prove it or like to display it to anyone else, but that's something beyond this human world, almost as you describe it, is happening, and
Yeah,
and and that's enough,
right. It's almost like the kind of process I went through is okay, what is a good life? And so I took the word what. Okay, well, what if we asked, how is the good life? Well, that kind of doesn't make sense. What if I asked, when is the good life? When does the good life happen exactly? And then I thought, okay, let me think about the word good, because the word good is usually, for a lot of people, fits in this binary. There's something that's good, there's something that's bad, and even that is sort of like, partly, it's influence on how you would even think about those terms, like whose definition are we talking about in terms of what's really good, and you got cultural influence on the question, and then, like what does it mean to be to what is a good life for a person who's required to do dumpster landfill diving in El Salvador in order to make it through the day? Does the question imply too much agency, as if the good life is something that we just kind of go out and we can more or less just kind of make it through our decisions versus the influence of conditions? But at the end of all that, you know deconstruction, and I think we talked about this a little bit with Nietzsche's, his idea of the love of fate, or the love of one's fate, that is that not just accepting, but actively loving everything that happens in life, including suffering and loss, because it is necessary and even good, and it can be metabolized into growth in a more complete life. Now, I do know that's a little privilege, right? Like the person dumpster diving in El Salvador is like, well, don't tell me about how this is like feeding, so I get that. But all I'm saying is there, what is the definition of a good life that's accessible to every person? You know, and for me, it is what we're all going to suffer, and there's always going to be loss, and it's very difficult to make this relative, although I guess it is in ways. And obviously the little girls in forced child prostitution, their human suffering may not be the same of mine, if I and even my emotional suffering, you can't really quantify it. You shouldn't even try to do that. But the point is, as you said, that that whatever, everything that there is to embrace of that is meaningful is about right now in this moment, and our being, our being with it, you know, and and that can mean a number of different things for people. What it means to be in a moment where you're with someone you love, what it means being with a moment where there's a beautiful sunset. What does it mean being with life when you're planning your escape from an abusive spouse? It means something different for everyone in every moment. But to me, it seems like that a good life is about the that point of contact with our world and what happens, in that moment, as opposed to something that we interject into it from the Netherlands of religion. And I guess there's a way that someone could accuse me of saying, and it is true, I guess, that I perhaps have a certain faith in life itself, that the life itself offers that possibility. And there is some faith in that, because there are some people who wouldn't necessarily believe that, and I would understand them for not believing it. But I think that I do have a kind of faith in life itself. Now, I don't think it's completely unfounded. I could say, look, modern humans have a 300,000 year history of sort of working this shit out, you know, like surviving and thriving, but I think it's a faith in life.
Yeah, I wouldn't even add anything to what you just said there. I think there's something with the moment you said that I felt it profoundly resonated with me. I'm not going to speak on behalf of humanity, but there's something so I just see it present in my own life. Now, once again, you could say there's far more traumatic things. There's also, though, far less traumatic things that have happened to people, and I don't think they enjoy their life as much as I do.
Yeah,
So whatever way we want to make it about anyone else, I can speak about my own experience. So, and I remember there's things going on in my life which I've said to you before about making my path, making a living from what I'm doing. I approach things a little bit like an artist at times. Now I maybe get put more attention on the requirements of life, and that's in that economic sense. But I remember waking up one morning on my bed a few weeks ago, and it's quite a large bed. I'm 6'4", my wife's almost 6 foot. We already got a large bed before our daughter came along.
yeah,
But I woke up at 6 in the morning. My wife was kind of laying on one side of the bed. I was kind of using her as a bit of a pillow, laying back on her. Um, my 2-year-old daughter was kind of sprawled out on one side of the bed, and then my dog had jumped up on the bed at some stage in the night and was sprawled out somewhere else. And I was kind of asking myself, like, am I stressed about the current situation? And I was kind of like, there's some stress. And at the same time, too, like, what was occurring right now was still occurring. Like that, like I get up early anyway. This wasn't some middle of the night thing, but I was still able to just appreciate that my wife was there, my dog was there, my daughter was there, and they were just all kind of surrounding me. And I don't know, like there was such simplicity to it. And it doesn't mean that everything is okay with the world, or that there's everything is in its rightful place all around it. But this is what I knew in that particular moment. And now, some moments are easier to come into contact with than other moments, obviously. And yet, I don't know. There's something about what you just said there that I think an awareness of in my own life, irrespective of what is occurring. It feels like plenty enough for me. So I think what you just said there really captured something that I hadn't put it that way specifically, but that resonates a lot, and that I don't know, I find there's something very moving about that.
yeah. I think that one of the practical tools, I guess you could say, that I've learned is um, this question. At any moment, the question, what does this situation require? Like
Hmm.
that's the only question that matters right now. And I don't know, that may not be, but just kind of thinking along those lines. What does this situation actually require? And I've had to really like develop that, because someone could say, well, okay, you're drinking a cup of coffee. What does that require? Enjoying the coffee, like, oh my God, I'm so hurt by this. What does this situation require? Feeling the hurt. That's
Yeah.
what and my faith in life is sort of built around the idea that if I respond to life as the situation requires, and of course I've grown to figure out what that means, that there's something there that is redeeming, even in the worst case. Like, if what a situation requires is me to like confront someone, which is something I don't like to do, right? I don't like conflict, but if it really requires that, if I actually accept the invitation of life that shows up in the moment by doing what's really required, then I find value there. You know,
Yeah.
um,
You might hate my use of the word of saying amen here. But that's honestly, that's all that was coming up for me, Jim.
yeah,
That like there's something, when you mentioned earlier that sense of just loving every part of this life. And I don't know for me if that trust in life is tethered to some notion of a, you know what I think it is? It's probably just some sense of the absolute connection of everything. And I won't go into that, and even in a philosophical sense or how I might experience that. I think there's probably something in that, and then probably some notion in a reality far beyond, I guess, what we are conditioned to see. You mentioned the global north there at the start, and particularly in some parts of the world, what we're particularly conditioned to see. But Jim, you beat me to the punch of asking that question at the end of what is a good life. But
well,
I'm glad you did, Jim, because I just absolutely adored where you went with it. And just to say, I've really, really, as I kind of thought I would all day today, I've really enjoyed listening to your perspectives, your experiences of how you've come to this place. Whether that's the religion as a solution to your own difficulties growing up, the crisis of faith that you experience, what that leads you to, or what that prompts you to in terms of the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality, and then also just this idea of spiritual formation beyond the sense of just more than the human world, and all the kind of arc of the journey that you're going through, in the sense of leaving the church, and not just from a spiritual point of view, but from a career point of view, the places that brought you to, the depths of suffering that you've witnessed, and what your own interpretation and the broadening of your own experiences of life, and this ultimately allowing yourself to connect with it all, and what that brings as well. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us on the What is a Good Life podcast today. It's been a real blast.
yeah, it's been awesome. I appreciate it. I think one of the things I'm going to take is what you just said, which might be the most important thing that's been said, is that like there are sometimes we think about the interconnectivity, maybe something even beyond the normal human experience. And so, I think what does the situation require when we wonder about this is the wondering. It's the curiosity. It's being there with that. Maybe it's there for a reason. It's something you're wondering about. It's maybe something that's reaching out to you, and to be there with it. So thanks for that. And I loved our conversation, and I appreciate you and look forward to talking again.
Thank you very much, Jim. We'll be in touch. Absolutely.